Hey, this is Stacy. Welcome back to the Soul Pod. Today I want to talk about the spiritual emergence that's happening right now. I know you feel it too, don't you? There's all these changes that are happening all around us, society and the way we talk and the way we do things and the way we think and the way we make our decisions and what we find acceptable and what we find unacceptable. It seems that we're becoming more and more evolved. Is that the right word? We'll look at that today and maybe ask that question. Is that what's happening? Is this a personal evolution? Is this a societal evolution? A worldwide evolution? Are we ascending to a new level? Is that what's happening here? We'll look at some of the symptoms too. If you're feeling it, go on this ride with me. This may run for a couple of videos, but I want to dive into this. Take a look at it. So, some of the symptoms we're seeing are things like meditation and mindfulness becoming something that's more and more acceptable in society. And that's sort of widespread, and it's not really considered all that woo woo anymore. When I was growing up, people said they meditated or talked about spiritual things, even used the term spiritual. It was seen as kind of woo woo in 70s, 80s, 90s, even by the 2000s. But something shifted. Something is shifting. Something's continuing to shift. We're seeing this play out in a lot of different ways. More people are getting into mindfulness and meditation, paying attention to what's in here, putting more emphasis on becoming personally evolved, worrying a little bit less about what's out there and worrying more about what's in here, or at least finding some balance with it. Another thing that's interesting is we seem to be becoming a more open or tolerant society. This is showing itself in a lot of different ways actually right now. Um, the way people are accepted for who they are, the way people are encouraged to be who they are, to be genuine to themselves, even if just in an exploratory sort of phase of our lives, just diving in and exploring who we are when we're young, so we don't have to figure it out when we're older. You know, it wasn't all that long ago that was scoffed at. In the 70s, they used to say, I'm going to go find myself. And, the older generation would go, oh, he's going to go find himself, or she's going to go find herself. And now it's like we're at that point where we're encouraged to figure out who we are, to find ourselves, as it were. And it's a beautiful thing. That's a really, really nice evolution. So we're more open to people's personal choices of exploration, of lifestyles, of I mean, you see this manifesting itself in things like even the Burning Man Festival, where if you've never been to the Burning Man Festival, what you tend to find there is that there's this wide open acceptance of exploring. It's like getting permission to let your inner child out. Just run around, be wild, be crazy, be silly, be youthful, be joyful, playful, silly, and explore. Just explore in a city of 80,000 people in the desert. That's something that would have been unheard of on this scale when I was young. It would have been the most outrageous thing in the world. Maybe to you it is still an outrageous thing, but I think more and more people are putting that on their bucket list. A trip to Burning Man. I recommend it. There is absolutely a cultural shift that's happening. It's undoubted. It's uh, it's undeniable, and we see this in other things as well. Things like the number of yoga studios that have opened. The increase in yoga studios is astronomical. I saw some data on this, and the increase in yoga studios is almost on par with the decrease in the number of churches that are open. The churches are closing at about the same rate yoga studios are opening. Yoga studios are moving slightly faster. Um, Not to say that yoga is innately a spiritual thing, but you tend to find that people that say they are spiritual but not religious, they tend to go to yoga studios. Not always, but often. That's another thing too, the spiritual but not religious movement. People say I'm spiritual but not religious. There's something about this beautiful shift that's happening with us giving ourselves permission to be responsible for our own spiritual path rather than relying on a leader, a minister, a priest, or whatever to tell us what our spiritual journey is supposed to be. We're plowing that path for ourselves. We're deciding as we go what works, what does not. It's like being in the grocery store. If it's for you, you take that off the shelf. If it's not, you leave it. Maybe it's for someone else. And there's much less judgment around it about our spiritual decisions. Our you know, instead of being a rigid religious experience, which is, by the way, becoming less and less rigid as well. You go to a church now, it's very different than the churches I would go to when I was young. Much less rigid in the way of thinking. It's much less controlled. It's much less hard edged, I would say. And so even that is evolving. And I think it's because it needs to, because the people require it to. Otherwise, those numbers will continue to shrink. I don't think religion will completely go away, because I think that some people like having a foundation for their spiritual growth, like having some guidance for their spiritual growth. The growth of spiritual coaches, for that matter, are another indicator that some people are spiritual and they want to be responsible for their own spiritual growth and making the decisions around exactly how they do that. But a little guidance is good too. Having someone suggest and say, well, have you tried this? Well, have you done this? Have you, oh, well, what's happening with this in your life? And guiding a little bit on different things we can try to expand our spiritual experience. So all these things are happening. And there seems to be a huge rejection in authority. Have you noticed this lately, especially in Western cultures? We're challenging authority. We're challenging it more and more. You're seeing governments change even over this. People just wanting to try something different. No judgment on whether that's right or wrong. It's a symptom. It's a symptom of change, that people are ready to change. We're challenging authority. We're challenging our government authority. There's less trust in government than there has been probably in my lifetime. I saw an interesting study that shows that this is true, that there's a huge rejection in supposed authority figures in the world today, whether it's government or whether it's organized news. Now there's an alternative news sources, tons and tons of alternative news sources people are turning to with greater levels of trust than they ever have. And now the levels of trust we've had in traditional media are getting lower and lower and lower. And there's probably a lot of reasons around that. But it's pushback. It's also a symptom of this spiritual change that we're seeing in the world. We're also exploring really before really unexplored or a phenomenon that was scoffed at before in some ways. There's universities that are studying things and have been studying them now for decades in some cases. Things like near-death experience, past life regression, and some other more wild things, actually. In the next video, actually, I'm going to dive into a topic that might melt your brain a little bit. It's something I recently tuned into that I find fascinating, amazing, and incredible, that one researcher is starting to look at very closely. Eckhart Tolle said, when you become comfortable with uncertainty, infinite possibilities open up in your life. And I think that's where we're at. I think we're becoming more and more comfortable with uncertainty, with the uncertainty of a lot of things. And I think that's why we're starting to look at different topics that are maybe out there, maybe not scientifically measurable, because perhaps the scientific process is a bit flawed, a bit too rigid, like so many of the other things we're showing off that seem a bit too rigid. So in the next video, we're going to dive into a topic that is out there, but that at the same time, after looking at it just even that much, is making me a believer in something I never thought I would believe in. Telepathy? Telepathic communications? Is it possible? We'll find out in the next video. Thanks for being here. Thanks for hanging out. If you haven't checked out the Soul Podcast yet, check it out. It's a great show. We've just finished season 3 and we're about to launch season 4. It's longer form topics of these same sorts of conversations, the sort of unexplainable things that are nonetheless undeniable.